Yeah, okay, so I'm Rhonda Broussard, pronouns she, hers. I'm originally from Lafayette, which I have to tell people in New Orleans because that means like 50% of what New Orleans is, I deeply understand. There's like another 30% that I can learn, and then there's this 20%, y'all, that's like deep in the blood, like what ward you're from. I can't talk to people about that. I can tell you where I live, but I don't viscerally get what it means to represent the Ninth Ward. But we're delighted that we have the honor to share space with y'all today and to keep building community with the TEP Center. So I started teaching in New Orleans when I was 17. The first act of my career was squarely in education. I taught middle school and high school all across the country. And had my daughter, we were living in Brooklyn. She's 17 now. She was born right before Katrina in May. We started planning our move home, and then when Katrina happened, it changed our course. And so we went back to St. Louis, and I opened a network of schools in St. Louis. I was running that for about 8 years. And when Michael Brown Jr. was killed in August of 2014, it was the back to school institute time of the school year, it changed my perspective on what my work was, on what I thought the bigger work was to do. I would drive to school, my son was 6 at the time, would drive to school in the morning, and we had 3 campuses. One of our campuses where my children went to school, where my office was directly across the street from St. Louis Metropolitan, the brand new St. Louis Metropolitan Police Headquarters. And would just drive into school crying every day. Like, I can't keep my own son safe. I can't keep our babies in school safe. Even if we get this right in our school community, right? We taught other people to organize in elementary school. Like, this is what power is. This is how power works. How you identify it in your house, in your classroom, in the school building, outside of this community. How do you advocate for change? Our families were very involved, and we were all committed to this idea of the beloved community, even before we knew to name that with our young people. And in that particular aftermath, I still felt helpless, right? We were doing all the right things. And yeah, like none of it's gonna stop the bullet. We were building a better diploma, and that wasn't gonna stop the bullet either. Our young people, if they're graduating from our high schools, are still often graduating into unemployment and underemployment, unable to advance, unable to maintain their family's house and housing for their own, the next generations to come. And so in 2016, we moved home, and I say home, moved back to New Orleans, and I was trying to figure out what this work was for me. And one of the earliest conversations I had was with Brother Ron. And to have the conversation with him in 2016, where I knew I needed to be moving differently. The US government was confirming that harder days were to come. And he was like a mom. I was saying this to Miss Maureen. When we first met, one, he physically reminds me of one of my great-grandfathers. And so I just felt at home in a conversation. I met with him and Diana Dunn, Jim Dunn's, what do you say was his past? Wife, but still wife. He is passed. I met with the two of them together. And we were having a conversation, and I was like, how do I start this work now? And what do I prepare for? And he's like, well, baby, I've been doing this your whole life. And this looks like the worst thing to you right now. But when I started the work, Black people weren't with me, right? I had to fight in Black community for them to hear this message. And so here's what we learned along the way about how to persist, how to keep yourself grounded, and know that this particular iteration is going to pass. And it was a really big inspiration for how we actually built Beloved Community organizationally and what we do, and why place matters for us. So we are an Orleans-based nonprofit. We are getting ready to move into the Secretary Annex, which is very exciting for us. At Beloved Community, we look at regional solutions around sustainable racial and economic equity. So New Orleans is home. We have about 30 team members. Half of us live here, and half are around the country. But we also work in other parts of the Midwest and Mid-South. So we do bodies of work in Memphis, Indianapolis, Kansas City, some emerging work in Texas. And when we think about what it takes to actually get to the Beloved Community, one, there's this aspiration that we might not ever actually fully be there, right? And how do we own that and know it, and know that we are moving towards something that is unseen and unexperienced, that we are trying to build a world that's not just anti-racist and not just confronting white supremacy, but that is actively pro-Black, that is actively pro-queer, that is actively pro-women. And we've never lived in this world. None of us. None of us have ever lived in a world without racism. None of us have ever lived in a world without patriarchy. We've not ever lived our actual selves. We've not actually lived in a world without homophobia and transphobia really deeply rooted into the core of all the systems that we operate with. And so our team, the long vision for us is how do we build something completely new? And so that first conversation with Brother Ronald helped me situate where our work for the living community is in this broader ecosystem. We don't, not only do we not try to replicate the work that the People's Institute does, but we're very clear that without that deep, deep, deep foundation, the parts that we bring into the conversation are not possible. And so there are actual literal prerequisites for organizations that we work with that say you have to have this readiness training, you have to have this understanding about how white supremacy works, what it looks like and how it moves. Because when you come into a first conversation with us, it is going to hurt your feelings if you have not already done this analysis, right? We're not starting at that discovery conversation for you. Oftentimes folks will leave some of the deep work with People's Institute where they're learning what happened, right? What is the history? How does this actually work? How is it impacting our systems? And you walk away saying, okay, well, what do I do about it? And the work that we do at the Living Community picks up at that question. We support teams on how to operationalize these principles, how to actually build systems that are different for the young people you serve, for the employees in your organization, for the community members in your neighborhood. And so with that, we have an equity at school strand where we work specifically with schools, any type of school, preschool through post-secondary, on your actual school-based practices. We can say that we understand that we have an achievement gap, if that's the language that you want to use. You can say that we understand that we have continued de facto segregation, if that's the language you want to use. But when we get down to it, there are actual very specific policies and practices that happen at the district level, at the CMO level, at the building level, at the classroom level, that we're not questioning. And so a large part of what we do is get organizations to understand how to question what are the different strands of action that you could take around diversity, around equity, around inclusion. And when we say diversity, we mean a representative sample. So are you getting to, is there a representative sample of blank in your teaching staff, in your leadership community, in your funded community? When we ask the equity question, to what extent are you getting to equitable outcomes, right, for any of the people who are involved? When we talk about inclusion, this is often the space where folks will lean in the most because they're like, oh yeah, diversity, I get it, it's numbers, it's representation. Equity, I get it, you're talking about moving money and power. When we get to inclusion, we're really talking about the extent to which your voice has power in the decisions that impact you. The extent to which you are actually able to inform what the policy and practice is and be able to shift as your people's identities require, right? There are some ways in which you build systems that say, okay, this is gonna edify me, but there are new generations who are coming along. And are we able to adapt to these new generations and listen to what they're telling us they need? As a parent, I say this to my own children, I say this to folks who are getting ready to have kids. If we can quiet ourselves, quiet our own ego, quiet our own expectations, our young people teach us what they need. They teach us what they need from us. And then it's our opportunity to serve them, right? And guide them along the path that's gonna be most beneficial for them. So our Equity in Schools works in that space. We do a lot of workforce development work as well. In New Orleans, it's a lot of hospitality, community, nonprofits, healthcare industry. And part of our work, so we have consulting services where we're working with leadership teams to do the things that I just mentioned. We built out a software system that helps folks assess and track their equity needs by the organization. So you could say, what does our team need? How well are we doing? What are the goals that we're gonna make? What's the multi-year plan? How are we preparing our organization for professional development, et cetera? And you have a resource for that. And then we also have an emerging, we call it the TEP Center, Data Research Impact and Policy, right? That looks at one, how do we get better at collecting both quantifiable data and qualitative data for the communities that we serve? publicly available data and data in community. What is then the research that we conduct either with that existing data or about the systems that we're working on, and then how does that inform policy? And so examples for what that looks like in New Orleans right now, we do a lot of community-based research, so youth participatory action research, and participatory action research for those of us who are no longer youth, where we're teaching mixed methods research practices with community members. And so what are the questions that you actually want to ask for yourselves? And particularly for young people. So we had Summer Research Academy this summer. Young people learned the methods and then decided that they wanted to ask a question about mental health. So they're now doing some of their own unique research in the city of New Orleans with their peers. And then they're going to be a part of co-analyzing that data. They're going to be a part of constructing the reports. They're going to be a part of doing that data dissemination. So when we get to the policy table, it's not, oh yeah, I work with young people and here's what I heard them say. Here are the young people who actually did this research and here's what they're saying that their community needs. We're doing something similar right now with Black and Latinx women through our program Yola Cares, who are in early child care careers or in hospitality careers. And the same idea that they have unique challenges right now in 2022, right? We can say, oh, 20 years ago when I was a mom or when I was on Medicare or when I had et cetera experiences, this is what I thought I needed. And we can build our programs to respond to that. But the experiences that these women are having today are different, right? In a pandemic, different migratory patterns, different ways that oppression is showing up for them. And so how do we take a perspective of humility around that and say, we're not just designing what we think is best for you, but actually bringing you into the conversation so that we can inform design and then inform policy advocacy as a result of that. What else should I say? Oh, love is belonging. So I'll speak on this last thing and then give you all the space back. We obsess about belongingness and agency. Right, so this question of belongingness, oftentimes when we bring it up to both school partners and to workforce partners, like what is it, why does it matter, why should I do anything about it? And what the research tells us, particularly for educational organizations, what the research tells us about belongingness is that young people, when they identify that they have a sense of belonging, a strong sense of belonging in their school environments, they have a higher rate of academic completion. Right, that there's the studies that say if I get to post-secondary institution and I have a high sense of belonging here, not only do I have a higher GPA, but I also have fewer visits to the medical center, fewer visits to a therapist or counseling center. My mental health is at a higher level because I have a higher sense of belonging here, and I'm going to finish the degree, and I'm going to perform in the workforce. And so really getting organizations to think about, for our youngest learners, how do we understand belonging for them in the classroom? How do we give them a space to communicate that to us? And then, as adults who are responsible for setting that culture, setting that environment, what are the ways in which we need to change our practices in order to respond to what young people are telling us they need to get to that sense of belonging, and not just focus on what is the academic expectation. And so lots of the work that we do with our school partners is, how do you name that for young people? How do you name it for your staff and faculty, right? You might be thinking, Rhonda, yeah, the young people need it, but I don't feel a sense of belonging in my own school, right? And what does it mean for us as adults to say, this is what I actually need to be resourced here, and how that's gonna have a positive impact on what my young people are doing in the classroom, what we're doing together. And then we do, if any of you are data research geeks, we do a lot of data research, geeking out on the belongingness end of the spectrum. There's I call it a small faith group, that is really looking at what is the research, how do we apply it, and then belonging to what, right? If we think full circle to the community that the McDonough experienced when they came here, and to the community that Brother Ron was responding to when they were starting People's Institute, we're not asking our young people to belong to oppressive systems anymore. And if you work with young people today, they're not taking it anymore. Right? They're really not. And the onus then becomes on us to say, what is our responsibility to really listen to this multi-generational articulation, right? I'm 47. My parents are the same age as Miss Leona, but the Lafayette integration happened for them in high school. And it meant that they have a very keep your head down perspective, right? And so my whole life, like, keep your head down, don't ask questions, don't challenge your teachers, and we're just gonna get through, was their perspective of having experiences as teenagers. So I often say respectability raised me, right? Respectability in politics is what got us through. You get this high school diploma, you get this degree, you get this kind of job, you get this kind of status, and this next generation is, so we don't actually need respectability anymore in order to have the needs and in order to live the lives that we need. And so it's the last thing I'll leave you with, that when we center on love is belonging, in particular, when you think about this next generation, they're telling us what they need. The time is for us to really listen and say, how do we need to adapt these environments and stop forcing our young people to belong to the oppressive systems that we have to contort ourselves in order to get to. Thank you, thank you.